Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're very excited to have you here for our discussion of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I am particularly excited or looking forward to discussing this movie with our special guest, Lynne Edwards of Ursinus College. Lynne, how are you tonight?
I'm good. How are you, Andrew?
Good. Thanks so much for suggesting this film and joining us for the discussion.
Oh, no problem.
And for your great introduction as well, which I'm sure we'll hear reference to over the next hour. For those of you who might not be familiar with our format here, we ask you to please keep your audio muted until or unless I have called on you to ask your question or make your comment. How will I know to call on you to ask your question or make your comment? You can use the raise hand icon within Zoom, and that will allow me to know who has a comment to make or a question to ask. And at that point, after you make your comment or ask your question, please remute yourself and wait for the pearls of wisdom to fly forth from Lynne, and fewer of them from myself, but maybe a few from me. And please feel free to make use of the chat function. We'd be very happy for you to introduce yourself to the panelists and the attendees. And if you are, in particular, from outside the greater Philadelphia area, we'd love to know where you're from and how you've been finding, how you found us, or how you've been finding our discussions. In fact, we have a feature on our website, Where in the World, where we ask people to let us know where they're joining us from, since the probably only advantage of this whole thing is that now what we do is online and people can participate from anywhere, which is really, really terrific. So we look forward to an interesting discussion about Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And I think we are ready to get started with one of our regulars first out of the box, David.
Good evening. Thank you again. Dr. Edwards, thank you for the choice and your introduction. I also noticed the posters of the noir and started laughing because of the obvious joke that we were being led in on. And I love the idea that one of the first things that we were introduced to in the pods going to the people was that cut on the hand. And I had actually said to Janice, I bet that's going to happen. So it was one of those really fun things. In addition to the comments that you made, right around the 55-minute mark, I felt like we were given one of the pure morals of the story. People change, they harden their hearts. No need for love, no emotion. I actually stopped for a second and wrote it down. And I was sort of interested in your view of whether I was interpreting our director and our writer correctly. And then one or two other quick comments, and I'll let you start responding. You made a comment in your introduction about sleep. When I was thinking about sleep, I was thinking about the way kids going through that certain age where they're afraid to go to sleep, and whether some of that was sort of what he was picking up in some respect. And at the very end, and you talked about the FBI ending, I read it or listened to it thinking about the communication lines were down to Los Angeles, they were down to San Francisco, and all of a sudden they sort of came back with the FBI. But I sort of was listening to it saying they weren't listening to the citizenry when the lines were down. And when the FBI sort of came in at the very end, somebody was finally listening. So I gave you a lot, and thank you again for the choice. And please give us more of your wisdom. It was wonderful, and I want to keep listening.
Thank you. And yes, I tried to write down everything you noted. I think there were so many layers, almost like the pods with their opening and then the oozing and the foam. But there are so many things going on in this film. First, the thought that these new pods really were imitations of humans, but without the emotions. And I think with Don Siegel, his take on that, or the message he wanted audiences to take away from that, was that as we become very comfortable and secure in our suburban or rural lifestyles. We believe that we're still good and nice people, but we've actually sort of started to numb our emotions, because to continue going along and maintaining the status quo means that you're very risk averse, you don't want to rock the boat, you don't want to challenge authority. And so the things that would need to happen to support others or to bring about change, you can't do because you don't have feelings, you don't care enough. I think he stops short of calling it empathy, but that's actually what's missing. And so the fact that these alien pods literally rob us of our ability to care about others being hurt or others, possibly being changed, was part of Siegel's message. For me, where it struck home, and I hopefully will not get too emotional about this, when the nurse said, yes, let's put the pod in the baby's playpen so she'll stop crying. And to me, that was the other part of it, because we generally think of women as being, very emotional, easily, frightened, easily, prepared to cry, loving others. And to see the mother figures actually being the bigger threats, like when Jimmy Grimaldi came running out, she's not my mom. To me, the loss of emotion was also, to me, particularly gendered in that way. I think what I found interesting, and I think what ties in with this maintaining status quo by being numb, is that, that at the end, the saviors were going to be the FBI, as if they couldn't possibly also be pod people. Because at this point, we think it's just Santa Mira, but we know that buses have left the town. We have no idea of whether or not, the authority figures are in on it. They've already taken over the comm lines. And so that quickly, we as an audience are not encouraged to wonder, well, wait, are these guys pods also? And for that to be the default savior was a bit odd. But I think that's what makes this film so enduring, because the more you start thinking about the unanswered questions or even the unasked questions, the more you realize that, the film maybe shouldn't have ended with the end. It should have ended with a question mark, because we really don't know how much of the rest of the world has been turned. And we're not even encouraged to think about it. We just know people got on buses with pods. And so to think that a government institution could save us from this was, I think, sort of a rah, rah, go America ending. But once again, it really even discourages the audience, maybe in a wink to the audience, that, you're pod people if you don't start to think that maybe the FBI or members of the police force have been turned, because we know they were out chasing Vanell and, I'm drawing a blank, Becky Driscoll. Did that answer your question?
You brought up a number of interesting things, and your response combined with David's initial comments made me think of a couple things I hadn't thought of before. One of which is, of all the institutions of our country and of our government, one that perhaps prizes conformity above many others is the FBI, right? Mm-hmm. That there's procedures, there are rules, there mm-hmm. are standards, and those things. I mean, we've all learned in the last couple of years that, among other things, they don't record interviews. They write notes immediately after they're over, like it's the 1910s or something. There's no way to document things electronically. And so, you're absolutely right. We saw that the police in that town had been taken over. We know the phone company has been taken over. Mm-hmm. So that stands to reason that the FBI might be next. The other thing I hadn't thought about, and of all the sort of potential allegories that this film presents, most people think of sort of the communist threat. Mm-hmm. You, in your introduction, mentioned the sort of growing civil rights movement and the changes like Brown v. Board of Education and others that were in the offing around this time, as representing a change that couldn't be seen, but some people found very threatening. One I didn't think of till now, but I think is actually might be a worthwhile avenue, is the conformity brought about by consumerism, the consumerism of the 1950s. I mean, this is the era of movies like, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit and things like that, Executive Suite. And the idea that when we talk about people becoming less caring and sort of, gradually or subtly, over time, sort of becoming less sensitive. And I don't necessarily mean that in the interpersonal sense, but more of a sort of literal sense, like less sensing of what is around them. You can think about the sort of, keeping up with the Joneses, dog eat dog nature of the consumer culture of this period. And it makes me think of another movie, which I never would have said had anything to do with this movie, from right around the same time, which is All That Heaven Allows, the Douglas Sirk movie, where, Jane Wyman is a widower is a widow, and she starts this relationship with this young free spirit, played by Rock Hudson, but she is reluctant at different points to pursue the relationship because of what her friends who are other, well-to-do society women think about it and say about it, and what her kids think about it and say about it. And that, she's fighting this battle, whether to feel and follow her heart, or whether to give in, whether to sort of shut herself in and give in to the pressure of all the other people who want her to sort of be this, isolated, loveless, emotionless person. So it really was a current running through the cinema, and I assume the culture of the time. Let's see, Ed, you have a question or comment? Okay, let's go to Howard. Howard, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, there were leaders, clearly, because they had to organize and arrange all the cars and the trucks. If they all were the same, who would become the leader? It almost was a sense that there were people who were smarter or who knew how to maneuver things, to manipulate, which was very different than what the pod people were supposed to be. So how do you explain the organization and the leadership?
Well,
Actually,
I have a thought on that, but Lynn, did you have an idea about that?
I was going to jump into this because I remember thinking that these pod people reminded me very much of a literal hive, in that the organization almost seemed organic, in that they were the worker bees. And part of my ongoing fear with this movie is, like, we think these pods are coming from outer space, but is there like a queen pod someplace?
Right.
But yeah, they just basically seem to be this very important internal organization whose only drive was to turn others. And for me, I keep thinking of biological metaphor like cancer. Cancer cells exist like really purely to just turn other cells cancerous. And that's what these pod people just seem to be doing, working within the so-called American structure of, the doctors have been turned, the psychiatrists have been turned, the police have been turned. So all of the authority figures that could possibly stop the pods are like among the first that are turned. For me, this harkens to the movie, oh my goodness, Village of the Damned, where, everyone's impregnated, and it's up to the teacher. And they all want to go to school to learn how to do all of these things to bring about the destruction of the world, because these are the institutional, the ideological status apparatus. It's late. I'm having coffee right now, but the institutions that sort of maintain our ideology. Once we are all conformed, we don't challenge, we don't question, we just go along. And so to me, the organization is almost intentionally mindless, except to turn others.
I also think that we know, because we see it in the film, but also a couple of characters mention it, that the pod people absorb the memories and experiences and they inherit enough of the personality of the person
Mhm.
to be a reasonable enough facsimile that acquaintances can't tell the difference.
Mhm.
And so it seems to me that when they take over a cop, whatever it was about that cop that, you know, gave him a sense of authority, or at least led him to do his job, as we see in the movie,
Mhm.
the pod person would have been aware of that. And if we look at most of the leaders or the people who take on leadership roles in this, they tend to be people who already had authority before they were pod people. That psychiatrist,
Mhm.
the chief of police, the other cop. So I think there's just some sort of, you know, and now I don't know if there are different casts of pod people, and, you know, they get to pick their person based on where that person's station, and does it mimic their station,
Mhm.
some sort of, you know, seating class equivalent of an airline or something. But I think that
Mhm.
I think that the fact that so much of the human had been retained explains how the people who seem to be in charge of things were also in charge of things as pods.
Mhm.
But that's an interesting question. Thanks, Howard. Ed, are you with us now? Okay, then we will go to Ellen. All right, let's try James.
Hello.
Hi.
I was just wondering, and this is a bit parochial of me, if there was any significance to the fact that she'd just come back from England, Becky, at the beginning, why they chose that she'd been on a foreign trip. Was that just to sort of suggest that she's slightly fancy, or is it something else going on there about, you know, being influenced by foreigners?
You know, interestingly, I can honestly say I'd never thought about that because I was just so drawn to the Reno connection that, you know, I was proud that despite the fact that I'd been born in the 60s, I knew what Reno meant, and that my students didn't.
Divorce.
Well, quick divorces. And so Reno was one of the few places at that time that you could go. Like, I think you had to establish residency very briefly, maybe 6 weeks, and then you can get a divorce. And so for these two characters to have both been there. But it's interesting that you mentioned England, because one of the other layers to this film for me is that location was so crucial to many of the points of the story. For me, her being in England just was once again a suggestion about the distance and potential lack of recognizability, how much she could have changed and why it might not be easy to discern whether or not she's a pod. The fact that the pods were always in the basements. Trying to think, there's some other like very, I think the hallways were always very tight. There was something else, and I want to say the images of transportation and just this constant change of location. So, you know, one of the first scenes where we see the doctor, he's arriving on a train. You know, one of the big plot points when we realize that the pods are literally being dispersed is the city center where you're seeing all the buses and the amount of activity going on there. The mental ward in the middle of the night where we see the doctor. But I'm so sorry, getting back to your original question, I honestly think it was just to mark her as having been distant and possibly changed. Andrew, what'd you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that both she and Benel have been out of town for at least a couple of weeks, and that explains why all of these changes are news to them. And my guess is that you know, the reason he was out of touch is he was at a conference doing important doctor things, and she was out of touch because she was in another country. And I suppose it was England because they thought that that would be sort of the least fraught country to pick that was still overseas and would explain a kind of lack of communication. So that's what I chalked it up to. Not so much that it was
Emergency.
England per se, but that it was, she was away and he was away and they were away for different reasons, but that allowed the pods to take hold without them having heard about it sooner.
Mm-hmm.
Ellen, you have a question or comment?
Yes. When Becky and Benel escape, the pod people pursue them angrily and noisily and seemingly emotional. Is that a flaw in the story?
I'm so sorry, Andrew. Go ahead.
No, Lynn, please go ahead.
I wondered about that so much because I'm just like, well, what do you mean by emotion? And if the pods have none, is it just love? Is it just the so-called like female emotions? Because those pod people seemed really kind of pissed. They were literally an angry mob. And I had another emotion question, but go ahead, Andrew.
No, I think it's a flaw. I think it's an unfortunate flaw. I can imagine that, you know, you're sitting there, you're making this movie, and for all we know, he tried to have them play it emotionless. But one thing we do know is that there were reshoots. I think those reshoots were about the book end, beginning and end.
Mm-hmm.
But I also read that there was laughter at places there was not supposed to be laughter at some of the early screenings. This movie was shot sometime in the first half of 55 and didn't come out to the beginning of 56. And that's
Mm-hmm.
not usual. There wasn't, you know, months of computer generated imagery to add like there is today. So, you know, that makes me think that there were changes and there were tests. And so one thing I can imagine is that they had to strike a balance between, you know, the belief, you know, the immediate recognizability of the couple being in danger with, you know, the fact that these people are not supposed to seem agitated or angry. And now the subsequent versions, I think, have made a silent, emotionless stalking seem very menacing. But
Mm-hmm.
perhaps it wasn't within Don Siegel's repertoire at that time. Or we also know the studio interfered. Perhaps they didn't care for it. I don't know, but I don't think there's any logical explanation for it within the film. I think it was a choice, and it stood out to at least some of us as a flaw, I think.
And I do know that with, I want to say Allied Artists, they definitely almost had an official position of not combining humor with horror. And I think given that if Don Siegel's comments and interviews are to be believed, he was literally attempting to comment on, as I said, the sort of numb society that only cares for itself and kind of maintaining its status and protecting the status for its family. And so some of the potentially political or snide humor was definitely cut out. But I've been thinking, was it James that mentioned Becky coming from England and maybe being marked as fancy?
Yeah.
I'm now thinking about the other thing that I thought was really interesting, and that was that they made it a point to let us know that Becky had attended college. And so here we have a college-educated woman who was in England. And so just these additional, not quite elitist, but definite class markers that are attached to this stunning woman whose clothes I totally envied.
She always had such a nice dress on.
Who goes to the doctor's office like that? But, you know,
right.
He's clearly crushing on the guy.
True. Ed, are you there with your question or comment? All right. Meredith, you're up next. Meredith, what's your question or comment?
Hey, Lynn, that's exactly what I wanted to talk about, actually, the dress. Because my husband was like, who goes in the middle of the day in this like dress with this like very extreme décolleté and, you know, and this movie immediately made me flash forward to Stepford Wives, you know, and this whole idea of controlling women and turning them into robots. And I wondered if part of what was happening was sort of cutting off this sort of carnal quality, you know, that she has, because she's extremely sexy. There's a lot of banter, you know, in the beginning, like, oh, I'll try my bedside manner on you later, you know. But I wondered if like that is kind of going away. Like by the time she's a pod, it's not like, in addition to like that lack of empathy, there's like a lack of passion or something as well.
Oh, okay. So we flashed back to the movie now. I do know there were production code letters sent to the filmmakers repeatedly about toning down the sexual innuendo and the other things that were happening. And I'm embarrassed to admit how many times I watched the film before I realized that when Becky Driscoll was scrambling eggs, that she was wearing Miles's clothes because she had slept over. So just the fact that I sort of missed that too. But the reason I got excited was because I was struck by the dress that she wore in the opening scenes, strapless, clearly. And it had a jacket, you know, at some point that she wore, but the frothiness at her cleavage, to me, was almost reminiscent of the frothiness of the pods. And it was just a weird connection because nowhere else do you, in the films, you see that kind of bubbly frilliness, except in the pods. Not even, I think, in the curtains or the other characters' clothing. But now that you mention it, Meredith, as the film goes along, her clothing does become more and more drab. Because I think by the time they're running, she's just wearing a simple like crew neck sweater, very plain, you know, flowered skirt, definitely, and high heels, of course, but definitely not the sex kitten clothing. Well, sex kitten, the sexier clothing that she's wearing at the beginning. Interesting. I gotta watch it again now.
Yeah, I mean, I was struck by that bedside manner comment particularly struck me as I was a little surprised that sort of snuck by the code. And there's clearly, you know, some definitely some lust happening. I think it goes between both of them. I think they're both clearly interested and pining for each other. She's a bit more interested in trying to keep things calm and appropriate, but there's definitely some romance brewing. And it, as you say, it's very strongly implied it took on a physical element, at least that evening. Anne, you have a question or comment? Okay, then let's go to Barbara and Richard.
Hello?
Thanks, Andrew.
Hi.
Do you want to start there first?
Barbara and Richard, go ahead.
Thanks, Andrew. You and Dr. Edwards have started down this road. I'd like to ask you if you want to go a little further. It struck us that the fact that you've got this kind of staid, suburban, standardized population in which the two heroes are both divorced would have been unusual for the 50s as a social role, as an isolated role. I mean, everyone in town seems to sort of roll with it. Like everyone seems kind of happy they both got divorced. Now they can like get back to their childhood romance or whatever it was. But I'm wondering if there's something more going on there, that because they don't fit in on that level, they also, you know, don't fit into the overtaking of their personalities by the pods, although Becky, you know, gets lost at the end. But I think just the role of divorce in the movie seemed something more than we've discussed so far. I don't know if there's anything to add, but maybe there is.
I'm so glad you asked that question because I don't remember which one of you said. First of all, I love you guys. You got me thinking about stuff I've not thought about with this film before. But we were talking about the authority figures and men, authority figures being the first to be overtaken by the pods. The other thing that struck me was this mention of family, that as they were sort of being dispersed to continue turning others, the question was, okay, what other cities do you have family in? Okay, great, turn them. Okay, you've all turned your families already, or your families have already been turned. Not only are Becky and Miles divorced, they don't have any other family. They don't have children. And the fact that they were the last to turn, to me, it points to this larger irony in the film or possible commentary. And I'm going to try to spell this out the way I drew it on a piece of paper. The pods are presented as being evil and bad because they are versions of us without emotion. And part of their argument is that, yeah, there's peace, we all get along, it's all fine. And nowhere does anybody say, you know, that could actually be a good thing. I mean, this thing that's being presented as evil actually has this potentially positive endpoint in which there's no more war, there's no more famine, everybody's getting along because we don't have enough emotions to be angry or outraged or to hate each other. And so the fact that two of the most passionate people in the film are the last two to be turned in that town, I have to wonder if there's some additional commentary there, that passion is what protected them. That, I don't know, divorce, I would think they both seemed brokenhearted, almost like an immunity to being taken over. But I think the divorce coupled with the absence of children just literally meant that it's like they weren't plugged in to be turned. So I think that could be one of the roles that the divorce plays for those two characters.
I think it also, you know, is another sort of mark of nonconformity for the two of them. They were traveling, they were out of town, but they don't have any of the normal familial attachments that the sort of conventional nuclear family people would have had at that time. But think about how that also means they're not connected to other things, like they're not connected to the schools because they don't have kids, and you know, they're not connected to you know, he's not connected to other things through whatever his wife would have been doing, either professionally or recreationally, and the same for Becky. So I think there's that element of isolation that happens to serve them well, or at least allow them to stave off being taken over for a while. But I think it also marks them as being sort of unusual already when the film starts. Particularly, you know, obviously at that time now that's not so unusual, but to each of them having taken their trip to Reno at that time in a town that small would have been unusual, I think. I wanted to mention that Ed communicated through the chat, he's having trouble with his mic, that he made a couple of interesting points. One is about the town, that the town is called Santa Mira, which means something like holy look, or something like that. Mira means to look in Spanish. The other thing, of course, that's interesting, if we're going to take the kind of Cold War tack on this, is that Mir or Mira, I'm not sure which, in Russian is world, like the Mir space station. And so it's interesting to think about that, you know, the town was supposed to be based on Mill Valley north of San Francisco. That's what the novelist Jack Finney had in mind. And they weren't able to shoot it there for budgetary reasons, but they cobbled together some outlying areas of Los Angeles to create the look of this town. And one wonders whether that name was an intentional choice by the filmmakers. It certainly stood out to me as an unusual choice, so maybe there was some meaning behind it.
And also, I've got to backtrack. I was wrong. I forgot. Becky Driscoll lived with her father. And so that was her one familial connection. And I think also with Becky in particular being divorced, that's one of the other elements of noir that we get a bit in the film, you know, because divorced women, you know, somewhat marked, clearly not virginal, clearly experienced. And, you know, she is part of the reason that Miles gets drawn into this, because of her more staid and, you know, chastened, ordinary looking cousin, Emily. I'm so sorry. My mind is going on the names, but her cousin not thinking that her uncle was her uncle. But I think that's the role the divorce could play with her character, but I'm still not sure why Ben was divorced. I'll let go of that now. Sorry.
That's okay. Let's see. Janice, do you have a question or comment?
Yes, I have a couple comments. I'm not usually a person who chooses to watch science fiction, but this movie, you referred in the very beginning to childhood fears. And when I was 4 or 5 years old, I had that exact fear. So it drew me right in. I used to feel that worry when going to sleep, that I would wake up and not be the same person, and my parents would be somebody else. And it was exactly what happened in the film. And the other thing, as you were talking before, more and more I felt it, and I felt it while watching the film, is that, of course, I'm watching it with today's eyes, but I could not help thinking of politics. And I don't want to start a war here, but I couldn't help but feeling, you know, I over the last several years, of course, have seen people that I thought I knew and had behaviors in every other way that fit with my own, who seem to have been inoculated with something different. And so I can't help but think of today's politics.
Well, thank you, Janice, for stating that as diplomatically as you did. That was very helpful and constructive, and I think you're, you know, I think it's a, you know, a perspective or a potential, you know, allegorical aspect of the film that we need to look at. I mean, we all know that in the 1950s it was, you know, the McCarthy era, but the idea that the idea that you have, you know, in that scene in his office when the psychiatrist and his former best friend, or the pod versions of the psychiatrist and former best friend, are explaining to him how great it is to be a pod, and they don't see why he wants those messy things like emotions and highs and lows in life, and he doesn't see how the plain boring existence they're talking about, how they could perceive that. I mean, they're just talking past each other, which is the, you know, reminiscent of the polarization we tend to have today. So I think it is an apt avenue for looking at the film, certainly. Lynn, your thoughts?
I think, first of all, I'm so glad that you said this, Janice, because I know I think I kind of skirted around it in my talk, in my introduction to the film. But one of the things that the film doesn't make explicit is why it's so terrifying to realize that the people that you thought you knew aren't those people anymore. And it's because of that next step, which is, well, what I've known about you, or what I thought I knew about you, implicitly meant that I could trust you. That if my house was on fire, or if I was threatened, or if I needed you, I knew I could count on you. And now I don't know that anymore, because you're already not the person I thought you were. And I think that fits perfectly in today's political climate. You know, I am also not someone who talks politics. I don't talk religion. I don't talk politics. I just do what I do. But I too found myself surprised. You know, I knew which of my family members were Republican and which of my friends were Republican, not because we ever said it, but it's just, you know, just something that we knew. But I was surprised about how surprised I was to learn that other friends were members of different parties, and not just Republican. The coffee is so not working. Third party candidates. I mean, just the spectrum of political attitudes that I wasn't aware existed in my small friend and family group, then leads me to thinking all of the things that the characters, Becky and you know, the non-pod people thought and feared. If you're not who I think you are, what does that mean for our relationship? And if you're not the person that I trusted as part of our normal binary, does that now mean that you're someone I can't trust? And that to me is terrifying. But once again, because you guys really don't suck, I'm now thinking one of the other plot points in this film is that we don't know what happens to our bodies when the pod takes over. And you mentioned, Janice, that your fear as a child was going to sleep and possibly waking up and your family not being who you thought they were, or you weren't yourself anymore. One of my longest running fears is that someone would pretend to be me, would take my identity, and I had no way of proving who I was. And so for the first time ever, I'm now thinking, oh my gosh, an additional horror for me in this film would be, what if my normal self and human self didn't disappear? What if I'm someplace really trying to scream to the world, no, I'm Lynn, that's the pod, you know, save me, believe me, I'm not crazy, destroy that thing. but that thing's a better version of me because it's not emotional. It's getting things done. It's, you know,
It's not better.
see, thank you. Oh my gosh. Oh. I literally feel my heart racing right now. Just the thought. Oh, okay.
But Lynn, I've noticed a pattern now. You've selected 2 movies for us, and we're very glad you did. But in both of those movies, we had cause to ask, where did the bodies go?
Yes.
So think about that. If you choose a third, make sure it's a body-free movie.
Well, actually, one of your people pointed out, I think, flaws in the film. Because to me, let me throw this out to the crowd. Did you guys think it was weird that Becky could fall asleep in what looked like an abandoned mine and get turned into a pod? You know, we asked where the bodies are, but where was the freaking pod for that one? Because she just woke up.
Right.
Weird.
Yeah, see, I was envisioning the whole time, I was envisioning that the pods were sort of like a Bluetooth speaker, and it had to be within a certain distance of your brain in order to pick up on it. So couldn't they just drive out to the middle of the, you know, the Nevada desert? Couldn't they go back to Reno and then fall asleep there because they're far enough away? So yeah, that was another issue with the movie. I agree.
Right.
Where was her pod that she unless someone had the foresight to put a couple pods in the mine, but that seems very unlikely, doesn't it? Let's see. Joss, do you have a question or comment?
I could go on for a while, but I'll try to keep it brief.
Thank you.
Okay, love this movie. I thank you for choosing it. It's been a favorite of mine since the first time I saw it, probably in the late 60s. Couple of things. The epilogue, the prologue and the epilogue that were tacked on. The epilogue in particular reminded me of the psychiatrist discussion at the end of Psycho, which also seemed somewhat awkward. Okay, that's one thing. The tacking on of the epilogue and the prologue and the cutting of the budget and all the constraints that were imposed on the filmmakers. Don Siegel nevertheless made this efficient, exciting, terrifying movie on a shoestring. And I just wondered if you had any comments about Don Siegel as a director and his career, which I remember most notably for his work with Clint Eastwood and Dirty Harry in particular. A lot there to chew on. Thanks again.
Oh, no problem. I think the part of this film and Don Siegel that I found interesting. I'm a bit of a mystery buff, so I was looking for montages in the film because that's really part of his rise to fame and acclaim in the production side, which is that he introduces almost not wholesale, but these really monumental montages into film that have the power to not only fold time, but to also capture the emotions of the moment of the film that he is now really just kind of reduced to a series of images. And I just found it fascinating that the only montage that I could find in this film occurred when the police were being called in. Because, and this gets back to my issue or interest in location in this film, we appear to go beyond Santa Mira when the police are being called in. And that was captured by the fact that that montage included so many different types of police cars that we now get. It wasn't just Santa Mira's little local police. There were black and white cars. There were things that looked like beige taxis. I know it's a black and white film, but bear with me. And so his ability to capture emotion compactly and visually is what really works for this film. Because if I'm paying attention, and I thought I was, that entire storyline takes place over 3 days. And so much happens in that movie that it feels fast and the pace is rapid, but there's just so much going on and we're still left. I'm trying to do the math in my head. 70? No. Oh my gosh. Has it been 70 years? I'm trying to do
64.
56, huh?
64.
64 years, and we can still find points in this film to talk about that are still relevant to us. And so, on one hand, I think Don Siegel's brilliance in that area was key, but ironically, the lack of budget, but then also the lack of high tech production abilities at that time also allow this film to continue being relevant, because whoever said they didn't like the remake, I'm feeling you. I think not knowing where the pods originate is key, because we're now living in an era of what, X-Files, Men in Black. I'm now wondering, did they really come from outer space? I mean, this could be some sort of FBI experiment. I don't know, but that allows this story and the emotions that this film tries to tap into, which are, I think, some very basic primal fears. It allows them to transcend time and place, I think.
I think Siegel is, well, first, regarding the constraints of the period, I mean, there's a reason that so many of us still enjoy so many films made in Hollywood between the 30s and the early 60s, and that's because they were working with constraints, technological constraints, budgetary constraints, and content constraints. And many times that leads to some wonderful creativity and some very interesting choices that wouldn't have been made otherwise. And I think Don Siegel is an efficient filmmaker, an understated storyteller, but he's also an efficient storyteller along the lines of what you were saying, Lynn, about how much happens over the period of time that the film takes place. And it's, despite, the shots of the oozing pod, and despite McCarthy toward the end on the highway there,
right.
It's by and large, it's a very understated film given its genre and given its content. And I think understated storytelling and efficient storytelling are two hallmarks of Siegel's career that you can see, for going forward from here for the next, 20 odd years he's making movies. And you see it in his protege, Clint Eastwood, as well. Very famous for being a very efficient filmmaker, but also for being an understated storyteller. And for that matter, in many cases, an understated actor. Some would say too understated for some parts. But I think that serves this film well, because as Lynn was saying, there was only so much they could have shown, even if they had wanted to show more. But Siegel probably wasn't inclined to want to show more, so he was thinking of ways to get the most out of what he could show, which is what he does throughout his career. Let's see, Richard and Nancy, you have a question or comment?
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
So just, I think, a stylistic question or two. One was just the use of music, which was on the one hand so 1950s, and that there was this frenetic music whenever there was a stressful moment, but the music, and I think it was almost exclusively non-diegetic. Would you say that's true?
Right.
It wasn't really used. Wasn't used in the storyline, and yet there were moments of quiet when the characters seemed to be a little more contemplative. Like there was one where Dr. Bennell was filling a syringe and the music stopped. And there were other moments as well, although I'm having trouble trying to remember what they were. But I wonder if you could speak to that, please. And also, the other was just a question about the use of shadows and the, chiaroscuro, whether this was this indeed early film noir? So, thank you.
Thank you. Lynn, do you want to start or should I?
You should start, because if Jennifer were here, she would kill it on the music.
Okay. Well, first I'll say that there are elements of film noir in this movie. There's some film noir jokes particularly with those movie posters in the pool room when we get to see our first pod, as Lynn mentioned in her introduction. But there's definitely some moments of very stark chiaroscuro. The one thing I would say is this is not early noir. This is actually pretty late noir. A lot of people would date the end of the original noir cycle to 1958, which is only 2 years after this film. So this is very late in the cycle. But I think your eye for the style is there. It particularly struck me when he sort of makes his first his first phone call, and he's still in his pajamas and robe, yet he has a cigarette and lighter in his pocket, and he sits down by the phone, and he's in tremendous shadow, and he lights the cigarette. So I think that's definitely here, and I think it's being used thoughtfully by Siegel and the cinematographer, whose unfortunately name escapes me right now, because they are trying to suggest, moments where there are sinister elements or there are sinister things about to happen. Regarding the music, I was struck as well by the fact that there are moments of silence, which is not something, a lot of movies from the 1950s often allow you to have. I think that there was some restraint with the use of music. I also think that I mean that in terms of an absence of music, moments with quiet, but also with the choice of music. I think some of the, when music is in the film is used to accent some of the, darker or scarier moments, it's not a cacophony of instruments and sounds. It's sort of, some low strings or some low piano sort of used kind of almost solo or in isolation. And I think that sense of isolation and loneliness is fits the film well thematically also. So I think you picked up on some interesting details that are definitely kind of ingredients that set this film apart from its, others of the time.
I definitely remember thinking that this was a remarkably quiet film. And as Andrew was talking about the use of or absence of music, I remember thinking initially that Siegel, and this is before I read about all of the problems that they had with the audience is laughing at incorrect points in the film, that Siegel seemed to have a lot of respect for his audience in that he knew they would understand the message of the film, like in the sense that they would not need to be pointed to particular feelings or emotions to have at particular scenes by music choice. And that I think the quietness added this level of intimacy to the point where this was clearly a love story, but it was also an unresolved love story. And so I think the absence of music, helps with that. And now I'm thinking about the fact that, they had to let the band go in the nightclub because there was so little business. So apparently, in addition to there not being any emotion, I'm wondering if it's like a double layer mention that, music is generally tied very strongly to emotion. And so the absence of it maybe adds to that sort of staleness as we become, or as Santa Mira becomes more pop-like. But I was definitely more honed in on the shadows because the cinematographer is Ellsworth Fredericks. And when Becky brings Ben home and they come in and turn the light on and, they make the jokes about bedside manner, when the lights are off, now we're dealing with two performers whose bodies literally become shadows. And I mean, I thought that the darkness there was, and I don't know how to describe it. I've never seen two characters become such dark shadows that they almost seem two-dimensional. I mean, they almost look like cardboard cutouts. The blackness was so intense. And then, she flicks light back on because they're not going to do anything. But I was really taken by the presence of shadows and when they were deployed. But I also think that Teddy and Jack's rumpus room or pool room was so heavily laden with shadows, doing very significant things that it was I thought it was meant to be slightly comical, if not satirical. but Siegel's awesome. I mean, that's my professional.
That's the
view on that.
takeaway, right? Let's see. Joan Nikelski, you have a question or comment?
Mhm.
Yes, hi. I want to make a comment about something you already talked about, and that was throughout the whole movie, I couldn't help but wonder, well, after the pod person takes over, what happens to the original person, their body? It wasn't made clear. And then you had to assume that the original person somehow disappeared or died or whatever. But then that made it really weird at the end, which you've already mentioned, that Becky fell asleep and there was no pod around her. And then she was now a pod person, but she still had her original body. So to me, that was a flaw in the original film. But then I went and saw the 1978 version, and they explained that. I mean, not explained it, but they showed it, what happened. I won't mention because maybe people want to see it, but I thought that they kind of solved that one.
Well, I think that was probably something that stuck in the craw of a lot of people, and it's just one of those things that either you're willing to sort of forgive it, or suspend your disbelief that far or not. I always figure when it's a movie from the 1950s that it's something horribly graphic and unpleasant that they couldn't even suggest because it was so horrible, like the pod person eats the original body or something just that was not going to fly. But that tells you something probably more about me than cinema of the 1950s. Lynn, we sort of covered the body thing. Did you have anything to add?
Well, for me, it gets back to also just the question of audience. So, yes, I've chosen 2 science fiction films for my visits with you guys, but in part because it's one of the few genres that has a really intimate relationship with its audience, because most science fiction, especially set in outer space, requires audiences to suspend inordinate amounts of disbelief, while at the same time having to meet some very stringent scientific standards. We now fully expect you to be able to explain how the lithium crystals work in the Starship Enterprise. But I remember seeing Jurassic Park with my husband, who is a bioengineer, and he had some problem with something that happened, like being able to determine a particular species of dinosaur from its poop. And I had to point out to him that, once you rolled with the fact that freaking dinosaurs were back on this earth, you just kind of had to let other stuff go. And so I remember thinking, why is it that I'm fine with believing alien pods and spores fell from outer space for some reason? That's fine. But oh my God, where are the human bodies? Like, that's what I have a problem with. But you're right. I still can't quite roll with that, except I just have to sort of laugh that off. But I know when I saw the 1979 version, I remember thinking, is this an indication of how far audiences have come for science fiction, that we literally need everything to be explained consistently or logically, not because we're dumb, but because we're now so scientifically literate that we need that answer. We need to know where that body went, and it better make sense. I don't know, but I forget who I'm talking to. I'm looking for your highlighted name. Do you prefer the original version or the remake?
I think she went. I think she went offline. I mean, not offline, but yeah, Joan. That was Joan N, and she didn't say what she preferred. I don't know.
No, I like both of them. I like both of them, but I just thought, well, I think the second movie was. Well, I like to know what happens to the body, so I thought that was good that they showed that. I thought that was more realistic, so to speak. But then the ending was more depressing with the second movie. The first movie was hopeful,
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's, once again, the lovely thing about science fiction is that it is really married to the social and political context in which it's produced. So by the 70s, and the fact that I think the 70s version is set in San Francisco, not in a small little town. And in the 70s, we've got a lot more diversity and progressive and transgressive issues going on in the world that can't be kind of ignored by setting it in a small town that no one's ever heard of, like they could in the first film. But by the same token, I found the first film, other than the absence of the mind pod and, you know, bodies, just like elegant and almost perfect, because it's creepy. It could still frighten, I think. And it's also one of the few science fiction films that works well on television, which is how most of it, well, people my age and younger were introduced to the film. And then, you know, I was useless for several nights after watching that thing. I mean, certainly did not go down to my basement again, which I think is a sign of a good movie.
That's true. Let's see. Joan Strank, you have a question or comment?
Hope I could do. I watched that version, the older one, and then I watched the new one. And what I had forgotten was that Kevin McCarthy appeared in the later the Donald Sutherland movie, knocking on the roof of the automobile they were riding in, giving out a warning. And he was like older, of course, because it was 20 years later.
Yes.
Yep.
And if I remember correctly, I think Don Siegel is actually driving that vehicle. It's a cab, right?
Yeah, I think it was a kid. Yeah.
Yeah. So like, these two awesome cameos.
Right. And for those of you who are debating whether to see the 78 version or not, I would just tell you that Donald Sutherland has a wicked perm in it. If that sets you one way or the other, then, you know, there you go. Let's see. Richard Chait, you have a question or comment?
Yes. I know how they like to remake old movies. Why don't they remake the movie and the man and the woman get together, and they probably vote for different candidates, but I'm not going to say who in the election.
I think, oh my goodness, I think the Nicole Kidman version, they get married, or they are married, because and that's the 2009, 2007, the 2000s. Yeah, because I think she's actually Dr. Bennell, and James Bond, Daniel Craig, plays a male Ben Driscoll.
Right.
So I think they even swapped the genders, and I think they're married. But the redeeming thing with the 1979 version is that Leonard Nimoy is in it, and I love him. That's it.
You are a sci-fi fan through and through. And let's see, Barbara and Richard Hirsch, did you have another question or comment, or did I just?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Only if we're not bumping someone else online.
Nope, you're the last ones. Go ahead.
Okay, I posted this in the chat also. Could you reflect on the number of times the metaphor of we have to get to the highway is used? Because I saw the highway as, you know, the opposite of the little town they're in. You know, people come and go from all over the place. It's like, you know, your only hope of escaping the drab, routine, mundane suburban life is to get to the highway, which is a trope in a lot of 1950s movies also. But it turns out that the highway wasn't salvation for him either, but it was used over and over again. I was just wondering if you wanted to reflect on it.
Lynn, did you have a thought on that?
Highways and bridges for me are always these areas that I consider liminal spaces, because when the characters are on it, they are literally between what they're trying to escape and not just where they're going, but the belief that where they're going has got to be better and is salvation and isn't potentially just as toxic and dangerous as the place that they left. And so the neat thing about, you're right, this constant reference to the highway, it's one of the few areas of agency where if you're in your own car and you're moving your body in your car on that highway, you have the slimmest bit of hope that you're actually evading all of these authority and all these institutions of authority and commercialization like buses and taxis and other forms of transportation that you don't have as much control over. So I think you're right. I think that highway reflects individuality, it reflects agency, it reflects freedom, but it also just is reminiscent of, like, you know, the Underground Railroad. If we could just get there, we're now people who are escaping, which means our essence has changed. So yeah, I think that highway metaphor and referencing is a lot more powerful than I initially thought it was. Thank you for raising that.
And I think this movie was made the same year as Eisenhower signs the Interstate Highway Act, or whatever that official name of that legislation is. So that's obviously, you know, something that is the potential, the utopian hopes of a, you know, massive, you know, broad, far-reaching interstate highway system are not lost on at least, you know, a fair amount of the country. The other thing I find interesting about that notion is that, you know, to me, it's something that works against the film in terms of its sort of, you know, the communism allegory, because I would think that the sort of that small town, you know, sort of enclave, that very much that Americana setting, if that's something you need to get away from, that seems to me to kind of be a bit at odds with the notion that this film is kind of an anti-Soviet or anti-communist parable. And I think it complicates things. I think everything that you, Lynn, and that Richard said about the highway is true and interesting. I just think it complicates the sort of, you know, thoroughness of that allegory. That brings us to the end of our discussion. I'm sure everybody joins me in thanking Lynne Edwards for her wonderful introduction, for suggesting the film, and for her insights tonight. We appreciate it. We will not be doing a discussion a week from tonight. It is Labor Day, so go have a barbecue with the people you are immediately sheltering with and nobody else. But we will be back the week after with another discussion of a film we haven't talked about yet. But between now and then, we do have some seminars coming up. We have a seminar on Ingmar Bergman that there are a few spots left in tomorrow night, taught by the wonderful Jennifer Flieger. And then, as you can see on the screen, we have a number of other seminars coming up throughout the fall on Tuesday nights. So please consider joining those, signing up for those, I should say. But other than that, we will be back here most Monday nights for a film discussion. We have a lot going on our website. You can check out brand new movies that you can only see through our theater website in our Theater 5 section. You can check out past discussions and other ways to learn about and have fun with film in the Film Studies Online section. And if you enjoy what we are doing and are as eager as we are to get back to the theater, please consider making a donation so we can hit the ground running when we are finally ready and able to open up the theater, and we can all have these discussions in person. And we can welcome Lynn to the Film Institute in person, which will be very nice. Until then, everybody, thanks so much for joining us. Lynn, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Take care, everybody.
Bye.